seller's scripts to ponder, a few seller scripts to ponder. There's one that I call the Are You Cooperating with Broker script. It basically goes like this. Hello, Mrs. Smith. My name is Phil Clodger with the Kai's Company, and I saw your ad in this morning's paper, and I was wondering, are you cooperating with brokers? Now, the response to that question, are you cooperating with brokers, is either going to be one of three things. It's either going to be no, what do you mean by cooperating, or yes. And let's look at each one of these individually. First of all, no. Do you mean, Mrs. Smith, that if I found a buyer for you at your price and terms, you wouldn't want me to show your property? I want you to concentrate for just a moment. I'm going to say this again, but I want you to concentrate on three words within that statement. And what I'm going to do is double the words. I'm going to say them twice. Do you mean, Mrs. Smith, that if I found a buyer for you at your price and terms, you wouldn't want me to show your property? By doubling the words do, the word that, and the word you, what you're doing is giving off this air of incredibility. I mean, Mrs. Smith, that doesn't make any sense. You want to sell, don't you? You're forcing a yes response. Most often the yes will come, but I'm not listing. And all you have to do is ask for the appointment. One thing that you want to remember, whenever you hear the word yes from a seller on the phone, they just gave you the appointment. It doesn't matter what follows it. A lot of times when a seller will say, well, yes, but I'm not listing, the salesperson will say, oh, okay, thank you, bye, and they hang up. What you need to understand is what they say following the yes doesn't matter. When they said, yes, I am cooperating with brokers. I may not be listing with them, but if you find me a buyer, I'll pay you a commission. The only way you're going to be able to find a buyer for their property is to preview it. You can't sell something that you've never seen before. So do you mean, Mrs. Smith, that if I found a buyer for you at your price and terms, you wouldn't want me to show your property? Now let's look at the second. What do you mean by cooperating? By that I mean that if I found a buyer for you at your price and terms, you would want me to show your property, wouldn't you? Look at the end of this sentence where it says you would want me to show your property, wouldn't you? This is what is referred to as positive momentum. Now, positive momentum is a format of questioning. Normally, when we voice a question, the words that actually create the question are at the beginning of all of the verbiage. As an example, we might say, wouldn't it be nice to go to dinner tonight? Well, the words wouldn't it be created a question, and the rest of it is just a statement of fact, go to dinner tonight. Positive momentum dictates that you reverse the formula. Rather than putting the question at the beginning, you put it at the end. You would want me to show your property, wouldn't you? It'd be great to go to dinner tonight, wouldn't it? If the statement that you're giving the person is positive to them, then you're forcing them to respond to you in the affirmative verbally, agreeing with what you're saying. You would want me to show your property, wouldn't you? The third, yes, but we're not listing. Well, great, Mrs. Smith, and so that I'll know exactly what you have to offer, when will be the most convenient time for me to preview your home? Would blank or blank be better? Now, of these three, most people, when I ask the question, which one do you think you'll hear most often? They'll say, well, the no. And in reality, the real answer is yes. Most sellers are cooperating with brokers. All they're saying is, I'm not going to list, or at this point, I don't want to list. You bring me a buyer, yes, if I can accept the offer, I'll pay you a commission, but I just don't want to list at this time. So they are cooperating with brokers. Now, because of this, because the sellers will answer yes most often, what you're going to find yourself doing is going to what is referred to, or what I refer to, as an abbreviated script. And the abbreviated version of what you just heard, I'm going to say it before I put it on the board, is, hello, Mrs. Smith. My name is Phil Clodger with the Kai's Company, and I noticed your listing has recently expired, and I was wondering, when would be the most convenient time for me to preview your property? Would blank or blank be better? Now, here's the sentence. Now, what did I leave out there that I had in the other? You remember at the very beginning I said that this is the Are You Cooperating with Brokers script? Well, notice in this that the Are You Cooperating with Brokers is left out. And the reason is basically what I'm saying to the person is, look, you have a property for sale. I'm a real estate licensee. It's my right to see your property. Now, once in a while, the seller will say to you, well, what are you talking about? Or he'll give you a negative response. Well, if that is the case, all you have to do is revert back to the original script. Do you mean, Mrs. Smith, that if I found a buyer for you at your price and terms, you wouldn't want me to show your property? Now, once in a while, a seller will, at the end of that statement, do you mean that if I found a buyer for you, at the end of that statement, a seller will say, yeah, I told you, I want to sell it myself. Now, at that point, I'm going to make it a little different. I'm going to say it one more time, and I'm going to say, I'm a little confused. Mrs. Smith, do you mean that if I found a buyer at your price in terms plus my commission, you wouldn't want me to show your property? Now, at that point, the seller really has nothing to lose. And so at that point, most often what they'll say is, well, yes, but I'm not listing. But if the seller said no a third time, then I consider that seller as focused on the word no. And there isn't anything I can say that's going to allow me to get an appointment. So what I'm going to do is just simply back off the appointment and gracefully get off the phone call. Let's go back to this top where it says the abbreviated version. When you start hearing the yes response to the first question, are you cooperating with brokers? When you start hearing that over and over and over again, what you'll find yourself doing is going to the abbreviated script, and you won't even realize that you're going to that script. Now, I want you to notice also that it's talking about previewing the property. Previewing the property. It doesn't talk about a listing presentation. It talks about previewing the property. And so what you need to do is to have a transition that will allow you to go from the preview into the marketing step of the listing presentation. And this is not difficult to do. It's very simple to do. But I want to give you this paragraph one time, and I'll put it on the screen for you to see, but I just want you to take it in for a moment. I'm going to use this in a way that isn't going to happen to you. And that would be that if a seller literally kicked you out of the house or said, I want you to leave. Again, that's not going to happen to you. But I want you to listen to this and listen to how powerful it would be. Mr. and Mrs. Smith, I can completely agree with you. I understand exactly what you're going through. I know you don't want to list your property with me. I wouldn't either. I wouldn't want to put my property on the market with somebody if I knew I could sell it myself or I thought I could. But I also know that if I wasn't able to sell it at some point in the future, I'd want to find a professional that could. Somebody that could find a buyer at the highest possible price in the shortest period of time. With the understanding that I'm not going to ask you to allow me to market your property today, let me show you what I can do for you if you find you need a professional. And then in turn, I'm just going to continue on, because at that point, I've taken away the threat. Now, that's the power of this script. But what you're going to use it for most often is what you see on the board, and that is as a transition. And with the transition, I've left something out, and that is the only if needed paragraph. Mr. and Mrs. Smith, I can really appreciate the position you're in for the sale of your home. I know you probably don't want to list your property. I wouldn't either. If I thought I could sell it myself, I wouldn't want to pay somebody to do something I thought I could do myself. But I also know that if I wasn't able to sell it, I'd want to find a professional that could. Someone that could find a buyer at the highest possible price in the shortest period of time. Mr. and Mrs. Smith, let me show you what I could do for you if you find you need a professional. And then just continue your presentation. Exposure is the key to the sale. The greater the exposure, the greater the likelihood of finding a buyer that will pay the highest possible price in the shortest period of time. Let me explain. And then you go right into your presentation. Now, if you'll notice right where I have the cursor right here, that's where you're going to place the only if needed paragraph. And that is anticipating the unanticipated. And that is the worst case scenario that I said a moment ago isn't going to happen to you. And that is the seller tells you to leave. But what will happen to you is that the seller will go defensive. In one of the previous webinars, we talked about why a seller will put no brokers in an ad. And there were basically 4 reasons. Number 1, they absolutely meant it. Number 2, or not number 2, but another one was they copied it from somebody else's ad. That was actually number 3. And number 4 is that the newspaper suggested it. They asked the person, do you want brokers to call? The person said no, and they said, why don't we put no brokers in your ad? But there was a second reason that they put it in, and it was basically a fear. And the fear is that if they listen to you, that you're going to talk them into it. And so what happens is that they go defensive on you. And by going defensive, they will start to, as an example, the wife reaches down and pets the cat, or the husband gets up out of his chair and walks into the other room and starts watching the ball game. And in turn, they look at you, but they're looking right through you. Or they're looking out the window, ignoring you as you're talking, as rude as that may be. But the question is, why are they doing it? And it's because you're beginning to make sense. And they're afraid that if they listen to you, that you're going to talk them into listing. And right now, at this point, they really want to try to sell it themselves. They really don't want to list their property. And so what you need to do is bring them back in. That's where anticipate the unanticipated is. If you don't bring them back in, if they're ignoring you, you can't lay a platform. You see, what I mean by a platform is that every seller out there with any degree of time associated with their motivation will pre-decide when they're going to list with a broker. As an example, if they, let's say, have to close on their new home in 5 months, they're having it built, and in turn they know that they have to close in 5 months. They'll say to themselves, okay, I'm going to try to sell it myself for 2, maybe 3 months. If at the end of 3 months I haven't sold it, then I know I'm going to have to list with a broker. The question is who? And so what I'm going to do is I'm going to interview every broker I can get my hands on. And I'm going to do that for 2 reasons. Number 1, I want to pick your brain. I want to find out if you know something that I don't know that might help me sell it. And number 2, I want to see if you're the one. Well, if a seller goes defensive on you, you can't have their attention, meaning that you can't lay a platform. What I try to show in the listing presentation and on a previous webinar was that you lay a platform that's so strong that you literally at that point void the impressions of all the brokers that have come before you, and in turn you become the standard by which they start comparing future interviews back to. So it's extremely important that you be able to draw them back from that defensive posture, and that's where you would use the only if needed paragraph, which is simply, with the understanding that I'm not going to ask you to allow me to market your property today, let me show you what I can do for you in the future if you find you need a professional. Now, that again is what's going to happen as opposed to the seller telling you to leave. That very rarely would ever happen. But I want you to look at the entire script for just a moment. And the entire script, notice that it's getting down to this point where the asterisk is, and that's where you add the only if needed paragraph. So, Mr. and Mrs. Smith, I'm changing the beginning of this for just a second. I can almost read your mind. I know that you don't want to list your property with a broker, with me, with anybody else. I wouldn't either. But I also know that if I wasn't able to sell it at a certain point in the future, I'd want to find a professional that could. Someone that could find a buyer at the highest possible price in the shortest period of time, with the understanding that I'm not going to ask you to allow me to market your property today. Let me show you what I can do for you in the future if you find you need a professional. Now, notice each time that I said that to you, and I've said it about 3 times, I said it with a different tone, a different inflection of my voice. When I was talking to the seller that said leave, I was a little stronger, but I used the only if needed paragraph. Here, I'm more jocular. I'm just kind of showing empathy towards the seller. If you look at this entire script, there are actually 4 component parts to it. And if you want to write these down, it's basically a diagram of this script. First of all, empathy. And that's where you're saying, I can really appreciate the position you're in with the sale of your home. And then the second is pure empathy. I know you probably don't want to list your property with me or with anybody else. I wouldn't either. If I thought I could sell it myself, I wouldn't want to pay somebody to do something that I thought I could do myself. But I also know that if I wasn't able to sell it, I'd want to find a professional that could. Someone that could find a buyer at the highest possible price in the shortest period of time. And then comes the asterisk, the only if needed paragraph. That's number 3. But put beside that, only if needed, and then in parentheses, only if needed. And then number 4 is just continue. Just continue with your presentation. Now, to put this into your own words, to be able to do that, what you need to do is just what I was saying earlier, and that is in front of a mirror, read this 10 consecutive times, and then in turn, turn the page over, and in turn, study it, try to paraphrase it. Once you've paraphrased it, done everything you possibly can, turn it back over, read it 5 times, consecutively out loud, 1 foot within a mirror, and then in turn, again, turn it over and try to paraphrase it. And then keep repeating those 2 steps, reading it 5 times and then trying to paraphrase it until you have it down pat. Realistically, it shouldn't take you more than about an hour, probably closer to 30 minutes to be able to do that.